Middleness in the social history of the Indian middle class. Welcome learners, in this module we are going to study about the middleness in the social history of the Indian middle class. In the previous module, we have studied in detail about the definitions of the middle class in India. This module will be a continuation with a few more concepts of middle class. The objective of this module is to study about the alternative theoretical definition of the middle class, middleness in the social history of the Indian middle class, the middle class and the ideology and the processes of development, the differentiation of the middle class. To begin with, alternative theoretical definitions of the middle class. Here are three hypothetical definitions of the middle class, mainly highlighting crucial aspects of post-colonial societies. First, the middle class is the class that articulates the hegemony of the ruling bloc. It is both A. expresses this hegemony by translating the relations of domination into the language of legitimization, and B. mediates the relationship between classes within the ruling bloc as well as between this bloc and other classes. The term articulation is being used here in the double sense of giving voice to as well as linking or connecting in a flexible manner. As a member of a ruling bloc, the middle class is responsible for managing the discourse of legitimization. This includes both the process of production of this discourse as well as the subsidiary practices necessary to ensure that it takes hold as the common sense of everyday life. Secondly, this class helps to manage the relationship between industrial, financial and agrarian capital within the ruling bloc and to mediate the relations between the ruling bloc and the rest of the society. The importance of the middle class is greatly enhanced by the fact that coalition is the necessary form of the ruling bloc in post-colonial India. No single class is in a position to build hegemony alone. The main axis around which hegemony is built and which also explains the peculiar centrality of the middle class is the developmental state. In the early years of independence, the transfer of legitimacy, power and moral prestige from the middle class leaders of the freedom movement to the masters of newly autonomous state was almost seamless. As is well known, conditions of the colonial backwardness produced a remarkably inclusive consensus on the need for the state-led industrial-based investment programs on the massive scales. The hegemony of the ruling bloc thus had to operate through and in the shadow of and the developmental state, which in turn was critically dependent on middle class administrative and technical functionaries. Given that during the Nehruvian era, the dominant legitimizing ideology speaks in the idioms of the patriotic production, the middle class adopts the posture of the proxy of representing the true protagonist of national history, the patriotic producers. The technicization of the development and the enormous prestige of the scientific technology also provide the middle class with a significant measure of legitimacy. Number 2, the middle class is the class that is most dependent on the cultural capital and on the mechanism for the reproduction of such capital. Cultural capital is undoubtedly a form of property that remains under-researched both theoretically and specifically empirically. Even the few available attempts to theorize it need to be adopted and modified before they can speak to the Indian situation. But there can be little doubt that the middle class more than any other is defined by its ownership and control of cultural capital. For the middle class, Such cultural capital may consist of particular types of identities like caste, community or region, and competences like educational, credentials, linguistic and other social skills. Such forms of cultural capital fulfill at least three attributes of the property. They confer tangible and psychological benefits. They can be privatized, that is, others can be excluded from enjoying their benefits, and finally, they can be transmitted across generations. However, the mode of its reproduction, transmission or inheritance is unique. An identity or skill cannot simply be handed over from person to person as other economic assets can, but has to be learnt afresh. At the same time, this does not mean that everyone has equal access to cultural capital. As with other forms of capital, initial endowments play a decisive role. Cultural capital is also peculiar in that it includes characteristic patterns of consumption as body has shown. Such consumption is to be conceived in a broad sense to include not only the consumption of commodities and services, but also of more abstract cultural entities such as ideologies, beliefs and stereotypes. But the most complicating aspect of the cultural capital is that it is frequently invisible as property, but is socially misrecognized as innatability or merit. Members of the middle class are, as a rule, owners of cultural capital. They may also possess innate talents, be hardworking, disciplined and so on. But in the self-image of the class, its achievements are solely due to innate ability, never to inherited cultural capital. Number 3. As an increasingly differentiated class, the middle class specializes in the production and dissemination of the ideologies. Its elite fraction specializes in the production of ideologies and its mass fraction engages in the exemplary consumption of these ideologies, thus investing them with social legitimacy. In concrete terms, the elite segment of the middle class can be thought of as including the intelligentsia in the usual sense, with a special emphasis on professional politicians, top bureaucrats, media persons, intellectuals and other specialists in legitimization. The primary function of this segment is to produce and transmit legitimizing ideologies along with the peripheral social practices necessary to sustain them. However, such an elite fraction by itself does not have the necessary social weight, the moral volume and the density that Durkheim spoke of to make these ideologies take root in the everyday life of the community. Although the above definitions are hypothetical, once suggested as food for thought, some indication of the ways in which they might be useful for understanding the Indian middle class can be found in the following historical account. The next topic is the middleness in the social history of the Indian middle class. Three main reasons have been offered for the special salience of the middle classes in colonial context. The first is in peripheral societies characterized by backward capitalism mediated by colonial rule, the industrial bourgeoisie is the relatively weak class and the intermediate classes, especially the intelligentsia and the professional technical managerial elite, is correspondingly much stronger than in Western context. And in the second, in such societies, the major thirst towards the capitalist development occurs after independence under the aegis of the developmental state, and the middle classes dominate the state apparatus. And third, partly because of the above two reasons and partly because they often play a leading role in antisocial struggles, the intermediate and middle classes enjoy great political legitimacy, which prompts them to go beyond their intermediate status and try to reproduce themselves as a dominant class. In India, the contemporary importance of the middle class and its post-colonial trajectory were shaped by its colonial role. Indeed, Indian nationalism was initially a creation of this class. The imperial power was compelled by circumstances to allow this class to educate and westernize itself so that it could supply the subaltern bureaucracy needed to administer the vast colony. At the same time, it could not be allowed the full measure of its ambitions, which were inevitably thwarted at some point. It is these disgruntled eliters who helped give birth to the idea of the nation and in time to a nationalist movement. As is well known, middle class professionals, especially the lawyers, dominated the middle and upper level leadership of the Indian National Congress. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that this class acquired a stranglehold on the state apparatus after independence and was elevated to the position of an indispensable member of the ruling bloc, the dominant segments of which were agrarian capitalists and the industrial and financial bourgeoisie. Given that this class helped to create and maintain a native public sphere in the colony, it carried over this role into the post-colonial period. Perhaps the main function of the middle class was to build the hegemony. This was a function it partly inherited from the Western history of modernization or capitalist development and the emergence thereof the contemporary forms of the bourgeois democratic nation state with a rapidly evolving economy. By the late 19th century, the Western role of the model of the middle class was ready for export and adaptations. The members of the emergent Indian middle class, urban professionals, the white collar workers in the government and industry and the intelligentsia self-consciously invoked this model based on a moral privileging of the middle class. In the Indian context, this moral privileging took the form during the colonial period of an ethical imperative to launch and manage the nationalist revival in the now familiar strategy, modernizing by imitating the West in the outer or material sphere, while at the same time reinventing a classified tradition protected from Western contamination in the inner spiritual sphere. The post-independence form of this moral privileging took the form of the development. The middle class saw itself as continuing the nationalist project by managing the developmental process on behalf of the nation. The middle class and the ideology and processes of development. Although we refer to them as members of the middle classes, the leaders of the nationalist movement were mostly members of the social elite who had taken to the new urban professions, particularly the law. It is only in the post-independence phase of Indian history that the middle classes in the contemporary sense emerged, consisting of people who were not substantial property owners and who were dependent on educational and cultural capital and the professional careers that these promised. This post-independence middle class was entirely a product of the developmental regime. This was true both at the ideological and institutional levels. Ideologically, the particular notion of development that held sway in the Nehruvian era conceived of it as primarily a scientific technical process over which professional experts should preside. The state, assisted by such experts, would bring about development on behalf of and for the people who needed and wanted it. In retrospect, this was a very depoliticized and top-down version of development that saw no active role for the people themselves, who were projected as lacking the technical expertise required to plan and execute development projects. But such a model of development gave pride of place to take the middle classes who formed the professional and technical workforce. Institutionally as well, the state-led model of development gave primacy to the bureaucracy, once again a preserve of the middle class. If this was the demand side of the mutually supportive relationship between the middle class and the developmental state, there was also the supply side. The massive expansion of the higher education and the strong emphasis on scientific and technical training swelled the rank of the middle classes. Most significantly, all this was seen not as providing unprecedented opportunity and encouragement for the middle class, but as a part of the great task of nation building. The middle class itself could participate in this task in the same spirit of high-minded dedication that pervaded all the state initiatives in these initial years of unbounded hope and optimism. This Nehruvian high-mindedness and the powerful sense of moral legitimacy that it engendered was an important factor in rendering invisible the unequal benefits that development brought to different classes, caste and regional groups. This could not be kept up indefinitely. However, eventually the failures and unforeseen consequences of the development process helped undermine the ideology of development. Although they were not noticed at the same time, the chain reactions were set in motion in the early post-independence period. These led by the mid-1960s to a pervasive multidimensional crisis that ended the Nehru era and decisively changed the trajectory of the nation. It hardly needs stating today that the development idea is no longer dominant. What needs to be emphasized, however, is that its decline was only partly due to its own failures. In other words, it is not so much that the development process itself has failed. The historical record on this account is a mixed one, but that development as ideology no longer resonates with the changed ideological context at the national and global levels. Just as this context once exaggerated the promise of development, today it is magnifying its real and apparent failures. It is not coincidental that the decline of the developmental state is accompanied by the differentiation of the middle class, which had experienced a phenomenal growth under the nurturance. The rhetoric of the Nehruvian era had seemed to issue an inclusive invitation to all members of the nation to come and play the role of the secular modern citizen devoted to the task of nation building. However, despite the absence of any overt attempt to constitute an exclusive audience, despite that is their apparent openness, nationalist narratives also served to differentiate rather than unite. As it became clear retrospectively, even that most modern and universal of languages, Nehruvian secular socialism had harbored subtle strategies of exclusion and selection. The secular modern citizen, though he remained unmarked in public discourse, turned out upon closer examination to be the simultaneously familiar and elusive middle class subject who continues to claim the pre-modern privileges of community, caste, gender and region. Caste was a particularly prominent marker of this middle class subject. One indication of this can be found in the fact that in everyday language, the term middle class often functions as a code word for upper caste. It is only very recently that the stranglehold of the upper caste on all middle class jobs, especially in the technical administrative sectors, has been loosened. The differentiation of the middle class. It is not surprising that possible consequences of the symbiotic relationship between the developmental state and the middle classes were poorly understood in the Nehru era. The standard approach was naive, unidimensional, one of the increasing the pool of scientific and technical manpower. Such an instrumental view failed to accord any agency to this pool, that it could constitute a powerful pressure group with desires and ambitions of its own do not seem to have been anticipated. It was only with the emergence of the brain drain phenomena in the late 1960s and early 70s that the problem drew attention. By this time, however, both as a cause and partly as a consequence of the weakening of the ideology of development, one could no longer be confident that the middle class, the developmental state and the nation were marching in step. While the issue awaits detailed investigation, it would seem that the middle class during the Nehru era was not only smaller in absolute size, but also relatively more homogeneous than it appears to be today. There seems to have been two major growth spurts which also resulted in greater diversification of this class. One during the late 1960s and early 70s, the other in the decade since the mid 1980s. As an initial hypothesis, one might surmise that the first spurt marked the end of the Nehruvian development, while the second presaged the era of globalization. The task of identifying the different coherent fractions of the contemporary middle class is an urgent one. Another possible axis of differentiation could be the type of cultural capital owned by different fractions of this class. This would produce something like an occupational distribution with a technical professional groups, generalist administrators, the so-called liberal professions, various categories of white-collar workers and so on. Access to languages could be an interesting indicator of the social character of different middle class fractions. One could imagine a division into monolingual English speakers, a large bilingual segment constituting of those whose first language is English, but who have firm link with some Indian language, and the other is those whose first language is an Indian one, but who are confident in English as well, and finally a large group which is rooted in Indian languages and has no real access to English. A more broad based division between the globalized metropolitan and regional fractions is also possible. This would give due weightage to the sphere of influence or action of each fraction. To these should perhaps be added a rural based fraction which continues to have its main base in the rural or agrarian sector, but it also a significant actor in the regional urban centers. Whatever be the actual ways in which the middle class may have become differentiated, the basic assertion being made here is about the fact of differentiation. The loss of hegemony experienced by the ideology of development is related to this process of differentiation. The ideology loses its address, its audience. As various fractions of the middle class evolved in their different ways, their perceived self-interest took them further and further away from the nation state, and the divergence between the ideology of development and the middle class increased over time. In essence, for the most influential and powerful elite fraction of this class, the nation is no longer the canvas for their dreams and aspirations. This is due to the decline of old ideologies as much as the rise of new ones, the emergence of subnational loyalties as well as the lure of the transitional identities. Conclusion: the historical context of the development of the middle classes in India is quite different from that of the West. It was in the 19th century, under the patronage of the British colonial rule, that the middle classes began to emerge in India. Though they emerged under the patronage of British rulers, the middle classes played an important role in the India's struggle for independence from colonial rule. During the post-independence period also, middle classes have been instrumental in shaping the policies of economic development and the social change being persuaded by the Indian states. Hence, in this module, the alternative theoretical definitions of the middle class and the middleness in the society history of Indian middle class is described in detail. The middle class and the ideology and the process of development are analyzed in the Indian context. The differentiation of the middle class is explained to show how the middle class has changed in terms of their ideology. With this, we conclude this session, and the changes in the ideologies has led to the globalization of middle class, which will further be discussed in the next module. Thank you.